all of the things that Marx and Engels will call class struggle, the emergence of class struggle in the 1830s and 40s. But there's a nationwide proletarian party that seeks to gain power in the state in England through democracy.
This is pop. Yeah, yeah. This is pop, pop.
So I'm going to read your bio. Spencer Leonard is a professor at the University of Virginia, a founding member of the Platypus Affiliated Society, and the author of books such as Adam Smith in Calcutta and Marx and Engels on Imperialism, which is coming out from Rowman and Littlefield. If things go to plan, he will also be editing an upcoming online journal called Sublation Magazine later this year. Spencer Leonard, welcome to Pop the Left. We're going to be talking about imperialism and I guess Bonapartism. But I wanted to start by asking you about your book. You're publishing Marx's Journalism. If I recall correctly, a few years ago, Mackenzie Wark claimed that everyone ought to focus more on Marx as a journalist. She also claimed that we were already living in a post-capitalist world and that Marx's political economic theories no longer applied to our society. So in this context, I'm wanted to ask you what made you desire to focus on Marx's journalism? What drew you to publish him posthumously?
Cool. Thanks for having me, Doug.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sure that I don't agree with the spirit of Mackenzie Wark's statements, but let's run with them.
Okay.
What does it mean to say? I mean, let's leave aside the issue of whether we live in Marx's world for a little while. Whether his political economy or his critique of political economy, illuminates our world or not. And just focus on the question of Marx's journalism. I mean, I think that the issue is, what do we mean by it? Marx, of course, began as a journalist. He wrote for a liberal newspaper in Cologne, beginning in 1842, called the Rheinische Zeitung. But what sort of thing are the class struggles in France or the 18th Brumaire? The Civil War in France was delivered from the podium of the First International. Was an address on behalf of the First International. And so, but even then, the question of the genre of Marx's writings is very tricky, really. And because it's not exactly the case that, Marx is writing like a Marxist, in the sense that, Rosa Luxemburg or Lenin, is engaged in a certain kind of polemical pamphleteering really within Marxist parties. It's like party literature. And, that's a completely bizarre genre. If let's imagine we're talking to young people. If we're talking to an 18-year-old and you put something like What Is to Be Done in their hands, right? A lot of the interpretive difficulty comes from the total unfamiliarity of the genre. Marx's literature is not called, Marx's writing is not exactly party literature, even when there is kind of a Marxist party. There's the Communist League, right? But the Communist League's really already dissolved by the end of the writing of the class struggles in France, and it's certainly dissolved by the time he wrote the 18th Brumaire. I think he wanted, he published that in a German journal that had only one issue, in New York City. that Joseph Wedemeyer was the publisher of. So there was a prospect of starting a journal in, of some kind of political tendency, socialist political tendency in the United States for German exiles, for 48ers. But what I've done is edit, I guess what I'm calling his journalism. What distinguishes it is that Marx is writing in the 1850s in a period of course, counter-revolution, where he, after the collapse of the revolution of 1848, which of course he's already, driven from the continent by the end of 1849. But, this was after, or at least most of what I've edited is after the coup d'etat in France, which is, Louis Bonaparte's coup d'etat in December 1851, which, everybody, all the exile intellectuals recognize is the definitive end of the revolution. Marx had understood that the revolution was over before that and had broken with, his own comrades and so forth. So he's writing for people, he's writing for pay. He's writing without editorial control. In most of what I have edited, this is writing that is primarily in English. Marx is at first he's composing in German and having Engels translate it, and of course Marx is a quick study, so within I think about 6 to 9 months, he's writing in English. For the New York Tribune, which is a Republican newspaper, with probably the largest circulation newspaper in the world at that time, in its weekly edition, which sort of took all the best articles of the week and put them in one paper and sent it around the country. So probably 200,000 to 250,000 subscribers for that. In the 1850s, it's a hell of a lot of people. Probably, Abraham Lincoln would have read it. Most Republicans would know it. It was Horace Greeley's newspaper. And of course, Horace Greeley eventually is a major, Republican politician. He ends up firing Marx because he balks at the radicalization of the Civil War. That Marx is in favor of, together with members of Greeley's own staff, a man named Charles Dana, who hired Marx. But there are other journals, but they're mainly liberal in inspiration, and that are in German. The most important is called the Neue Oder Zeitung, which is published in Breslau, and then the same publisher. I don't know quite what happens to that newspaper if it's sort of forced out of business, but the same publisher launches another journal called Die Presse from Vienna, and that's still a newspaper in Austria. It's a liberal newspaper in Austria. So some of it is translated from German, some of it is written in English. And I should also say that some of it was written for the Chartist press. And that was the closest thing that Marx would have had to real editorial control, because he was close collaborators with the radical Chartist, Ernest Jones, who was trying to sort of reboot Chartism in the early 1850s. And Marx and Engels closely collaborated with that. Before it collapsed, for about years. So that all of that, right? So it's writing in a period of of counter-revolution where Marx has no editorial control. There's some question as to why is he right? Is he choosing his topics? Of his sort of purely of his own interest, because he needs his articles not to be rejected, and many of them were, on ideological grounds as well as on the grounds of the subject being uninteresting to particularly American readers, because that newspaper the Tribune paid the best. So it's how he lived. Of course, he was in extreme poverty in the 1850s. So it's that writing that I have edited. So far I've submitted 2 volumes to the press, and there's a third forthcoming. It's a vast body of Marx's writings that, if you were to look at the English language collected works, forms about 8 or 9 volumes. Right, the journalism from 1851 to 1862, that when Marx is writing professionally. So that that is not the most important thing that Marx ever wrote. That is not where students should begin in the study of Marx. Absolutely not. And in that respect, she's just wrong.
Right. Well, let me ask you a question about something you said just a moment ago, which is that Marx was writing for a Republican newspaper, and then he also published with liberal newspapers, and then with a Chartist journal or newspaper. Did you mean to distinguish between the Republican newspaper and liberal newspapers? Was that a distinction that mattered at the time? Was that something that way people? Because nowadays, if you say Republican and liberal, that means Republican Party and Democratic Party. But what did it mean then?
Well, at the time, it meant that his editors, Horace Greeley and Charles Dana, who both had come out of American socialist circles, that were coming out of like the Fourierist commune, Brook Farm, that Nathaniel Hawthorne writes a novel about, the Blithedale Romance, which is one of these sort of utopian Fourierist communities in the 1840s. That's the newspaper comes out of that circle, and it's a serious journal, and there are a lot of serious intellectuals involved in well-known American intellectuals. Margaret Fuller is probably the most famous, and it's it's in the period that Marx is writing for them that the Republican Party is launched, right? So these are people who are anti-slavery Whigs, basically. They're going through the especially Greeley. They're going through the dissolution of the Whig Party. So what is the Republican Party? I wouldn't say I guess I would say that Marx would have been attentive to the fact that the United States was going through a massive crisis of its political system over the issue of slavery, that the entire party political system was undergoing a structural crisis, undoubtedly the most dramatic in American history. And so I don't think that Marx is clear or certain, or really anyone is certain about where it leads. Obviously, as everybody knows, German American 48ers, including many people coming out of the Marx circle, most importantly, Joseph Wedemeyer, whom I've already mentioned, and another man named Kluss. But there were others that Marx had kind of broken with, like Willich and Schopper. These people, I don't think Schopper, but Willich became, I think, the only communist to ever attain a general's rank in the U.S. military. And Wedemeyer became an important officer. They were all Republicans. All radicals were Republicans in the United States in that period, because the question of where that crisis would go was uncertain, and what the Republican Party's ideology was uncertain. So yeah, I would definitely. I'm
more curious about
in a sense, liberalism didn't quite exist.
Okay, that's what I was going to ask. Yeah,
in a certain way, it really depends on how you mean that. But if you mean it like an ism,
well, you said liberal papers, and I'm just wondering, would that Republican Party paper, or the Republican paper that was formed around the same time as the party, would they have considered themselves to be liberal, or would that have been a liberal paper? Or would you mean that
They would have understood themselves. I mean, Dana hires Karl Marx because he had gone to Europe to cover for the newspaper the Revolution of 1848.
Mhm.
And he had a professor who was a German exile who had left, well, really a German immigrant to the United States, who was clued into young Hegelian circles. And so Charles Dana spent time in France, but he also spent time in Germany, and he was, basically directed to meet Ferdinand Freiligrath and Marx. Ferdinand Freiligrath, the radical poet who was a part of the Communist League, and he went and met them in Cologne, and we know he spent at least one evening with Marx, because he recalls that to Marx when he writes to him offering him a job a few years later. And so, this was definitely the newspaper that was paying the closest attention to developments in Europe, especially, socialist developments in Europe in the course of the revolution. So, they would have understood themselves as, kind of, I would say that, they're sort of broadly social democratic. Certainly Dana is. When Dana is finally forced off of the editorial board, and first he fires Marx, and then he's fired about 2 or 3 weeks later in 1862. He goes on to be the War Department's liaison to Grant, to General Grant, in basically escalating the war to the kind of strategy that leads to unconditional surrender, right? He's the one who promotes Grant to Lincoln, and of course to Secretary of War Edwin Stanton. So he's a revolutionary at that level. He doesn't fully understand Marx, no doubt. He writes a letter that you'll find that Marx publishes in defense of Marx's character, in the polemic Herr Vogt, which is, surely one of the most obscure things that Marx ever wrote. A piece of polemical literature from 1860 that, whenever you read like Marxology, people get up, the authors are always mad that Marx spent a year or 6 months or whatever he spent writing this book because it delays his work on capital or whatever, right? But it's a great piece of, if you like, acerbic Marx, the sharp-tongued, vicious polemicist Karl Marx. It's his masterpiece. And in that, he includes this letter from Wedemeyer in which he says, I really like you, and you've always been a great friend of the workers, and we've always loved publishing you, but strangely, he accuses him of being a German nationalist. He says, the only thing I never agreed with you is your views on Germany. You always seemed a little too Prussian to me. And that really has to do with some seriously inside baseball about how Marx understood like the pan-Slavist movement and in general Marx's sort of inveterate hostility to Tsarist Russia, which wasn't shared by the editorial board. But let's not go too far into the weeds of these details, right.
Well, I guess what I'm trying to get to is the degree to which Marx himself might have thought of himself as a liberal of a kind, or a valued liberalism. It certainly is what allowed him to operate, right? The bourgeois formal freedoms of liberalism and the commitment to freedom of the press and free expression and freedom of assembly and all those kinds of things were important. And being a journalist makes those things, professionally important, not just theoretically important. But if you're a journalist, you sort of rely on those freedoms.
I would say that, Marx is a theorist of the crisis of liberalism, of the crisis of bourgeois society, of bourgeois societies, becoming self-contradictory. It's, as it were, freedom becoming self-contradictory. And in that sense, Marx is never breaking with liberalism. And politically, he values liberal freedom. He values liberal freedom to the certainly in his polemics with Lassalle, for instance. Lassalle would be willing to trade democratic representation for rights. In other words, Lassalle is leading the German working class into making a certain kind of peace with the illiberalism of Bismarck, so long as they gain the suffrage. And Marx and Engels howl in protest against that. That the rights of free speech, of assembly, etc., are the lifeblood of socialism as a politics that, of course, organizes itself in civil society. So, yes, his criticism of capitalism can only be understood, I would argue, as a imminent dialectical critique of the crisis of bourgeois freedom.
A while back, before I switched over to this channel, when I was at Zero, I interviewed Peter Hudis of the IMHO, in my humble opinion, our International Marxist Humanist Organization. And I, at one point, said to him, sort of in a defeated tone, listen, the truth is there is no Marxist party today. There is no real living communist movement. So all of us end up acting as liberals. We're all basically liberals. And he said, I'm not. And I said, really? And he said, no. And Marx wasn't a liberal either. People try to make Marx into a liberal, but he was a Republican. And I thought that was an interesting distinction to make. I wasn't sure if he meant Marx wasn't a classical liberal who believed in markets, or if he meant Marx wasn't a Democrat as we understand the Democratic Party today, or what he exactly meant by that. But what do you think? Can you guess, or what does that distinction mean to you if you when you hear it being made?
I mean, I think that obviously, I think for Peter and his generation, liberal is a bad word. Right. I think it gets into some of the sort of epochal considerations. What sort of creature is Karl Marx? He's one of the ways that I would put it is that he's a philosophe of the Second Enlightenment. That's a phrase from Louis Menand, which is to say he's an Enlightenment philosopher under conditions of capital. He certainly intends to be the heir to the high Enlightenment. That's what it really means to say that he's a Hegelian. Is that Hegel is, of course, the Enlightenment. Is an absorption of the whole of the currents of the 18th century. Now, there's a debate, or there's a crisis even within bourgeois revolution over the question of monarchy versus the republic. Right? We of course that exists in the English Civil War, right, which is resolved in some way, or that crisis is overcome seemingly by the Revolution of 1688, which establishes a constitutional monarchy, right? But obviously in the 1640s, there's an attempt at the creation of a republic. that has all sorts of classical overtones, classical republicanism, from the classical world, from the ancient Mediterranean world.
Mhm.
And the American Republic, of course, would be a much more salient example.
Mhm.
But the American Republic is also an empire for liberty, right? It's much vaster than any republic had ever been. Territorially, its representative institutions were quite similar to monarchical, parliamentary institutions. And even the French Revolution, didn't really make a virtue of republicanism exactly. There was every attempt to make Louis the 16th the king of the French, through revolution. They brought him from Versailles, very famously, and placed him in Paris and said, okay, now you're going to be the constitutional monarch, right? And it was on the 100th anniversary of the revolution of 1688-89. Marx does know that that history very well, and he knows that the bourgeois monarchy of Louis Philippe, which was supposed to somehow undo the counter-revolution, the July monarchy of 1830, also was overthrown and a republic declared. So I wouldn't say that Marx is choosing amongst political forms. I think that's a completely wrong-headed way of thinking about it. I think that Marx is Marx is recognizing what history has shown, and it's shown that the republic is the revolutionary form. But he's perfectly aware that there's a non-revolutionary republic in America, right? That's a fairly stable republic that's not just a revolutionary form. And his ideas about America are quite complex, and vastly transformed by the experience of the U.S. Civil War. But I would simply say that Peter wants Marx to be the theorist of socialism.
Right.
He wrote a whole book about how Marx has told us about socialism and how great it's going to be. And I think that's really a false way of thinking about it. I think that when we think about socialism, what we're imagining is bourgeois society realized. We're thinking about a society of world peace. We're thinking about a society in which the state is subordinate to society, in which society freely develops, in and through its own social relations, in which the necessity for coercion is gradually abated and eliminated altogether, that people are freely social with one another, etc. I think all of those ideas come from the Enlightenment. And when we say things like, and it would somehow involve the overcoming of work, and work would be like play and so forth, even then we're talking about the promise of labor in some ways in modern society. What that would really mean, what it would mean for society, for people to no longer be, in some ways motivated by the naturally or socially imposed scarcity is, I don't think anything that we can fully imagine. So I think that Peter, has some, that I would have some differences from him and from the humanists. I certainly disagree with his notion that Marx is a humanist and that's a distinctive philosophy, that is somehow more emancipatory than other philosophies on offer. I think that that's that you're just, this is that you're going to have to be convinced of a philosophy. I think obviously Marx is the philosopher of the real movement of history. And that's not exactly a philosophy.
Well, okay. So I wanted to talk to you about Bonapartism and see if I can connected to this question about liberalism and republicanism, and one of the things you just mentioned was that in England they had their revolution in the 17th century, and if I and what came out of it was a constitutional monarchy eventually, but it seemed to me that the getting rid of the monarch was difficult. Has been difficult, right? And I want to know if Bonapartism is in some way connected to that kind of difficulty that you would see when you're trying to get rid of the monarch. Is it the feeling that the civil society, the everyday people are not able to rule themselves, and that there's a necessity for a monarch that brings forward someone like Napoleon, or is it something else that is happening that would make the figure like Napoleon necessary? What did Marx have to say about Bonapartism? And is it? There's a story about from the English Revolution about the court kind of grabbing the king and bringing him, kidnapping him, and taking him into the castle and holding him, and he says to them something like, "Well, I'm the king. You can't do this to me." And they all turn to each other and says, "He is the king. I mean, after all, what are we doing, right?" And even though he has no violent, no real capacity to impose violence on them, he has no army anymore. There's still this aura of power around the king, and they have a hard time getting rid of him, and until he drops his cane in court, and then no one picks it up, and suddenly his power vanishes. This is the way I remember the little story. Do you know the story I'm talking about?
Yeah, I forget the exact words, but he would basically, he asks, basically, by what right do you detain me?
Right.
By what authority?
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I think that the issue is, I mean,
so is that the thing with Bonapartism?
Monarchism is super complicated. I mean, obviously Hegel's a monarchist, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right. It really, I mean, of course, it's in the British tradition itself. But if you look at a figure like Montesquieu, when he describes monarchy in the first half of the 18th century, he's really describing bourgeois society. He means a society of the rule of law, in which of course for him is typified or exemplified by Great Britain. That in the first half of the 18th century, the Enlightenment is just Anglophile. Mm-hmm. It's a kind of a cult of the British Revolution. Mm-hmm. People like Voltaire and that generation. Mm-hmm. And I think that that was a real question in the American Revolution, no doubt. And the allegiance to the king was one of the last things to fall away in the American Revolution. The early hostility was towards Parliament, and the redcoats, the British Army, were called the Parliamentary Army. And so we were fighting against, the Americans were fighting against a kind of oligarchical, corrupt parliament. But being a subject of the king, this causes a lot of people a great deal of confusion. Would have been a matter of pride or of a sense of security in the law. For the likes of a Benjamin Franklin or Thomas Jefferson, people, in the sort of left wing of the American Revolution. It's the significance of Thomas Paine's Common Sense that he, heaps contempt on the institution of monarchy itself in that pamphlet, right? Because that's what has to break. It isn't allegiance to Parliament, that's gone. Mm-hmm. And so I would say that, the issue of the British Revolution for Marx is, he's just inheriting a bourgeois notion that he talks about the British debts against the revolution, that somehow Britain owes the revolution. And what he means by that is this is a revolution that turned against revolution. This is a revolution that fought the Americans. This is a revolution that organized counter-revolution against France. Right? He constantly talks about the anti-Jacobin War.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That what the British fought was against the revolution. They weren't fighting against the tyranny of Napoleon. Don't believe their lies. Right? They were fighting against the French Revolution from beginning to end. And so, Britain is a kind of image, and it goes all the way back to 1776, of betrayed revolution, right? It's a kind of a funny image of 20th century phenomena, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's why the Enlightenment ceases to be Anglophile and becomes kind of French, is that Britain is viewed as betraying the revolution, of course, vis-a-vis the Americans in the 1760s and 70s. And so Marx, he has complicated ideas about Britain, where he's in exile in the 1850s. And of course, he also is aware that Britain has given rise, that the inheritor of the British demands for the reform of Parliament, because which was really the demand that the American Revolution was about, right? There was, of course, all sorts of agitation in Britain itself, including demands for radical reform of Parliament and extension of the suffrage. And those demands are then taken up by the working class in Chartism. That they're taken up in the demand for the Reform Bill of 1832, which is sort of the British equivalent of the July Revolution in France. And the inadequacy of that reform gives rise to Chartism, which is entirely focused on the question of suffrage, right? But it has a class character, right? It's the first politics of the working class. And it is forming a party, right? So these are obviously super important for the formation of Marx and Engels' thought. It's absolutely central to the formation of Marx and Engels' friendship, because Engels understands these things about English Chartism and is writing them up in, of course, his book on the condition of the working class in Manchester. That really solidifies his friendship with Marx. That they see, not only is there the Communist League and the Blanquists that have tried to overthrow the French government in 1839 in a kind of coup, and not only is there the Silesian weavers revolt and, Lyon silk weavers and so forth, all of the things that Marx and Engels will call class struggle, the emergence of class struggle in the 1830s and 40s. But there's a nationwide proletarian party that seeks to gain power in the state in England through democracy. And that's, of course, a super important question. A critical element in, when people say Marx gets his political economy from the British, and he gets his socialism from the French, and he gets his philosophy from the Germans. These are people who don't think about Marx's political development. His political development is, crucially influenced by Chartism, no doubt. And so, I think that what he sees in 1848 is a kind of a deepening of the problem of democracy. Right? What does it mean that, at some level, he thinks that, the French Revolution, the modern revolution is coming back. He writes the Communist Manifesto. He thinks we're going to be the left wing. We're going to point out the line of march, right? That talks about, in the Communist Manifesto, the communists point out the line of march. But the communists don't organize separately. They sort of push democratic revolution. And what he comes to realize in the course of 1848 is the necessity of class-independent organization,
Mhm.
of rejecting any state that is not working class, that in which the working class, through its independent organization, is not coming to power.
Mhm.
So a strong distinction between the Democrats and the proletarian socialism,
Mhm.
because he sees that democracy is a site of contradiction. It's ultimately the site for the the undoing of the revolution. First of all, with the election of the National Assembly, that leads to the appointment of General Cavaignac and the June days in 1848, the massacre of workers in Paris in 1848, and then, of course, the democratic election of Louis Bonaparte to the presidency, and then the democratic ratification of his coup d'état
Mhm.
by um, by a general suffrage vote in France, by universal suffrage vote in France. So Marx is Marx is arguing that democracy, coming out of the experience of the revolution, that socialism isn't just going to be like the radicalization of democracy.
Mhm.
That radicalizing democracy isn't just going to mean that we come to conquer more and more ground for more and more and more, as it were, strata of society.
Mhm.
Looked like the French Revolution had gone in that direction, that it had kind of radicalized towards the sans-culottes and the
Mhm.
Jacobins,
Mhm.
and that communism was, in a sense, an extension of that process.
Mhm.
And it's really, the idea instead is that um, democracy is going to come to be the ultimate, as he puts it, sanction for a new type of relationship between state and civil society. It's going to sanction the emergence of a new form of state, and that the state itself is going to be the locus of the problem of politics.
Mhm.
Right?
Yeah. Okay. So that brings me to Bonapartism. Um, so the state itself is going to be the locus of politics, but it also, the vision was that civil society would dominate the state after a socialist revolution, right? The civil society,
Right.
the public realm would be more dominant than the state. But Bonapartism is a moment where that vision is abandoned and state
Right.
power
So if we go
dominates.
back to like bourgeois thought, if we go back to like the Abbé Sieyès,
Mhm.
right, he understands, or really to John Locke,
Mhm.
um, they understand modern revolution as the subordination of the state to society. Right.
Right. And that would be, and they're looking at that state as a monarchical state at that point, right? To a large extent, they're thinking in terms of absolutism to
Yeah, but monarchy is becoming, the king.
constitutional.
It's becoming the crown, right?
Yeah.
Um, and in this sense, the American Republicans have a crown, right? They have the
Right.
presidency, right? They have the permanent, executive branch.
My
Uh,
kid the other day said to me, could you imagine a world in which, like, in the United States, we didn't have a president anymore? Would we need a president anymore under socialism? And I said, I don't know, probably not.
no,
But
no,
that's what he kind of envisioning would be that society would be more
because
significant than.
we wouldn't need a state, right? So the issue is, that that the crisis of society, the
Mhm.
self-contradiction of society, the production of its morbid, rotten symptoms,
Mhm.
its unemployment, its criminality, its homelessness, its urban rot, it's lumpenization.
Mhm.
All of the categories of disintegration and social regression that Marx uses, all the language that he uses, all the rhetoric that he uses a lot of language of, that sort of refers to corruption, like the prostitution, right? Or the cesspool of corruption, right? The state arises from the cesspool of corruption generated by capitalism. All of these things, right? It's a kind of it has a kind of criminal character, right? The essence of the state is the Society of December the 10th, is a kind of bunch of thugs around Louis Bonaparte. That become the kind of the police of the empire. His understanding is that the social contradictions of capital, with socialism defeated, socialism failing to address the crisis, that crisis is met by the imperial or Bonapartist state. He uses those terms interchangeably. Right? Those are just interchangeable terms. It just means what's exemplified by the Second Empire in France, which is Bonaparte's empire. So it's imperialism, it's Bonapartism. And he's saying that the state is, the state is holding together a society that otherwise cannot be held together, a society that is otherwise in open crisis. And so,
did it have to be imperial? I mean, was it just a contingent fact that in that moment the Bonapartist state was an imperial state, or did Marx see the imperialism as a key aspect of a Bonapartist management strategy for this crisis?
The category of Bonapartism or imperialism is the political, which of course, as I just tried to say, implies the necessity of the dictatorship of the proletariat, right?
Right, but that didn't arise.
The mirror image of it, right? It indicates the necessity of the working class seizing power, because otherwise that power will be seized by something else that will meet the crisis. And it's the political corollary of a social category like capital.
Right? Oh, okay. I want to ask a clarifying question.
So these are the imperialism categories for Marx that, just if I may.
Yeah. Okay. Let me just ask a question. So the imperialism is what suggested to Marx that there was a need for the dictatorship of the proletariat. The fact that the capital was expanding from nation to nation and grabbing resources around the world, that's what made the dictatorship of the proletariat seem necessary. Am I correct there? That's why that was implied, was because of the expansiveness of the capital.
Of course, by imperialism, he doesn't just mean like overseas power of capitalist states.
No,
right? He means the reversal of the process of the socialization of the state, that a power is extruded from society that stands over and against it with force.
Right. And that could be within a society, within a nation, as well as outside into other nations.
Within a nation, most fundamentally, it's a domestic problem.
Okay.
And of course, it comes to manage the crisis of bourgeois social forms like private property, right, which are in crisis, right? So it comes to facilitate banking and monopolies and cartels, etc., that give rise to a new form of capitalism. So Marx's earliest arguments about state capitalism are, what he calls it imperial socialism, which I love. Because he's talking about all of these Saint-Simonians, all these socialists who are advising Louis Bonaparte. If you read his articles on the Crédit Mobilier, which really is a very advanced form of sort of the involvement of the Federal Reserve with Wall Street and et cetera, right? That kind of nexus in 1850s France. And so for Marx, the imperial state, what I guess what I'd try to emphasize is that it signalizes for Marx the necessity of taking power, and that what you would be dealing with when you took power was the self-contradiction of bourgeois social relations, what he calls in the Critique of the Gotha program, bourgeois right. Right, that it's the self-contradiction of bourgeois right, it's the self-contradiction of liberalism that the state is managing, and that the seizure of power by the working class would allow that self-contradiction to become, as it were, tractable as a democratic problem. It would allow it wouldn't be the revolution in a sense. It would allow for the democratic revolution to address the most fundamental tasks, which is the crisis of society. So it could do things like try to make everybody work, which would just indicate the self-contradictions of bourgeois right if you tried to do that. If you tried by political fiat to do that. And so the imperial state for Marx is it's indicating the necessity of revolution. The state is a kind of a symptom of the crisis. It doesn't really pacify the contradictions of capitalism, though it does manage them. And of course, revisionism, is really a kind of misrecognition of that management for resolution, right? If you look into later Marxism, it thinks that the state is kind of containing the problems of capitalism. Whereas Marxists will argue, no, the growth of the imperial state is indicating the sort of the depth of the problem of capitalism. It's a deepening of the problem. I'm condensing a lot here, Doug, so I'm sorry if I'm saying too much.
No, it's fine. I'm trying to I'm thinking of something that your friend Chris Catrone once talked about, was how Eugene Debs thought that that the working class needed to not put a limit on imperialism or put a limit on the expansion of capital overseas and the development of the rest of the world by capital, but rather seize it for the workers in an international effort. And I heard something similar here about Bonapartism. It's like Marx didn't believe that the problem with Bonapartism was the expansion of the state, but that the state, it almost sounds like that. No, what needed to happen was that the workers needed to seize the state in order to manage the crisis of capitalism differently, democratically, in order to overcome that crisis.
Right.
In a similar way. I have an easier time understanding what Chris means than I do what you mean about the state. Maybe because of my old days of being an anarchist back in the 90s. But I understand, like, imperialism abroad brought development, technological advances, industry, and wealth of commodities, which could feed people in a way that they couldn't, more easily than they could have been fed before. It changed the way of life. It brought modernity. But with the state, that seemed to be more about authority and the exercise of power and coercion than it does to the advancement of industry. So
Sure.
I'm wondering about what it was about the state and the need for the proletarian authority that Marx saw and wanted to embrace. Maybe this is the old new leftist.
Let me try to speak in a very plain way.
Okay.
I'm a historian of India, basically. That's my profession and my field. And the problem of imperialism in that sense, like in our kind of what we imagine of a kind of colonizer-colonized relationship,
Mhm.
not settler colonialism, but Europeans ruling over populations that already have an advanced division of labor, that have already created agricultural civilization, etc.
Mm.
That's a problem that is faced by the bourgeois revolution. um, you know I will correct your introduction, with your very gracious introduction, to say that I have not yet written the book Adam Smith in Calcutta,
Oh, okay.
unless I called my dissertation that,
Yeah.
and I didn't call it that. Uh, I don't know what my committee would have said, but I did conclude my dissertation with Adam Smith, and it's about the conquest of India. Um, Adam Smith is dealing with that problem. He sees, of course, the empire of the East India Company in India as a real problem for the English Revolution. That it's a source of power it's a source of support for a British oligarchy that is resisting the necessary development of the revolution.
Mhm.
That it's in many ways more serious than what they're doing in America. Um, so he sees the crisis of the British Revolution as having an overseas acute expression.
Mhm.
And that's what the Wealth of Nations is all about. So the Wealth of Nations is always about, just constantly talking about India and America.
Mhm.
Because those are the two sites for the expression of the crisis of the British Revolution in his day. Now, Marx, well, no, let me say this. And Indians take up the critique of the East India Company as and when they come to absorb English education, liberal attitudes,
Mhm.
which is a long and complex process, but is definitely taken place by the 1830s in the major colonial cities of British India.
Mhm.
And they are not in a position to lead society, and they know it, right? There's no way for the um, educated, politically minded elites of India to lead the Indian people in any kind of anti-colonial measures. In the Great Revolt against the East India Company in 1857, the three colonial centers, Calcutta, Madras, and Bombay, they all oppose it. They see it as completely reactionary, anachronistic. It's looking back. It's trying to restore the Mughal Empire. They don't want to have anything to do with it. So you don't really get mass political struggle against imperialism in India or anywhere else until World War One,
Mhm.
and after. Right. So Marx is writing in that context, and later Marxists are looking at that context, right? Where, yes, there are revolts. Yes, there are opium wars. There are Indian revolts against the East India Company, and later against Crown rule in India.
Mhm.
But there is nothing that that in any way has any organizational connection to um, to European politics and to socialism.
Mhm.
One of the things that I look at in the book, is the set of writings that first got me interested in Marxist journalism, which is his writings on India from 1853.
Mhm.
And he's perfectly aware of the fact that there are these middle class and capitalist forces, social groups emerging in India
Mm-hmm.
who are writing to Britain. They're seeking representation amongst British liberals. They're funding them.
Mm-hmm.
They're funding pamphlet campaigns. They're funding, the formation of civil society associations to advance British Indian interests, etc. And Marx, in those writings, talks about the public opinion of two worlds. That Parliament is adjudicating and betraying
Mm-hmm.
the public opinion of Britain and of India. The general idea that all of them had,
Mm-hmm.
whether liberal or socialist, was that the empire was directed again was not only an exploitation of the colonized people,
Mm-hmm.
but it was a strengthening of in the bourgeois epoch, the sort of oligarchical element within the Constitution. It undermined the British Constitution. It, in that sense, undermined British liberty. And the East India Company was certainly the target of all European liberals. There were no European serious liberals, British otherwise, who made any kind of peace with the East India Company. They all celebrated when the Americans dumped the East India Company's tea into Boston Harbor.
Mm-hmm.
But in Marx's era, of course, things are different, right? The question arises, what would happen? Right. Marx believes that a socialist revolution is possible in his day. What would happen if we seized power?
Mm-hmm.
Right. We would inherit the bourgeois, in a sense. Part of the critique of Marx of imperialism, of course, in the age of capital, is that it's precisely not expanding around the world, or that the way in which bourgeois society incorporates people is by marginalizing them.
Right. Okay. That's two different statements.
That's not bourgeois. That's not Adam Smith's problem. Adam Smith thinks bourgeois social relations are going to spread all over the world. They're the destiny of humanity.
Mm-hmm.
Right. We need to advance our revolution as much as possible on behalf of all of humanity, and make the British Empire into an instrument of emancipation. And and the incorporation on the basis of advancing human liberty of mankind.
Mm-hmm.
For when Marx is looking at this question in after the 1848 revolution, he says the misery of the Hindu, by which he means the misery of the Indian people, is that their old world is being destroyed and no new world is being put in its place. Right? That there's, on the one hand, there's a destruction of the traditional forms of society, and on the other hand, there's no robust bourgeois society. And that's just a straight application of the way he views Germany. Right? Is that Germany, Germany is sort of getting bourgeois society without freedom, right? Its bourgeoisie is degenerate. And so he's prepared for that problem, looking at Europe. But when he, so his thinking about it is primarily social. He doesn't think the main issue is British rule, right? He thinks this is the same thing that's happening in China, even though there is no European rule there. This is the same thing that's happening in South America.
Well, this is why political economy is important to bring in with Marx, I think, because what happens is that my understanding of imperialism is that it's a consequence of the concentration of capital, which means that it's contradictory. It's not as though imperialism is about, some people talk about colonialism or settler colonialism in cultural terms, where like what's happening is you have people going out and imposing a way of life on the rest of the world and forcing them to be modern and forcing them to live in skyscrapers.
If only.
Right. No, what happens is that you go in and you find cheap labor in order to exploit cheap labor, but also, I'm not the details of the economics of this are kind of evading me at the moment. But the point is that you have these concentrated corporations, really big corporations, which are seeking profit, and they're seeking profit without developing the realms from which they are intruding. It's not as though what you get when you go into a third world nation and take up the labor force is a big open market and a bunch of competitors and the and better production and more employment necessarily. I mean, that's the story we're sometimes told about these things. But what often happens, you have concentration, speed up of production, but the profitability declines, and you don't have the development of the region that you're in terms of production that's very quick. So the technology is not, the innovation doesn't happen. You don't get a lot of competition because the original corporation needs political control just to keep the conditions so that they can maintain profitability when they're as concentrated as they are. And so you've just got this contradictory situation where these very powerful forces of production go into other realms and as you said, fail to spread. They exploit without succeeding, really, at their own aims. Is that a good way to think of? Am I getting
Yeah, I
close
mean,
to?
obviously, like free labor doesn't expand, right? In any kind of secular, unidirectional way. It doesn't. India has had 500 million people in its villages, um, or has 500 million people in its villages at least right now,
Mhm.
right? Even China, the workshop of the world, uh, has hundreds of millions of people tied to the land, and it's got unemployment problems in its cities, right? It's not continually like the only thing that sort of drives people off the land in India is poverty and the impossibility of their agricultural life, and so you
Right,
get these huge slums, right? In
right,
the slum cities of Asia, uh,
right.
and so the whole pattern of urban development is, of course, transformed, et cetera. The This is what Marx means, right? Is that the bourgeois social relations, in kind of crude terms, are rooted in free labor, right? In the commodity form of labor, and there isn't a commodity form of labor if you can't sell it, right? If you can't sell a commodity, it's not really a commodity. You haven't realized its character as a commodity. And obviously, the crisis of capitalism is a crisis of the commodity form of labor, even in the very heart of the Industrial Revolution, even in Manchester itself,
Mhm,
right?
mhm,
And in order to prop up the employment of Manchester, you have to sell more and more to the non-Western world, which means, of course, the destruction of all of their cottage industries in textiles, etc.,
mhm,
tool making, all the rest. So Marx goes into all great depth about all of that
mhm,
in his writings on the 1850s, in the 1850s, about India and about China, and his analysis of these sort of backward-looking revolts, um, in the Second Opium War and the 1857 revolt in India, really interesting, because he knows they don't really, in any direct way, point a way forward, but they are political expressions of a desperate social crisis. Um, so the issue of capital is one, that the characteristic form of the expansion of capitalism is sort of the absence of capital and the
mhm.
absence of jobs, right?
Right.
So a lot of times, of course, young people think of that as like traditional society, or these countries they aren't capitalist or something. Obviously that's not true. And after Marx's life, or late in his life, and into Engels' life and in the Second International, you see the expansion of imperialism, of sort of high imperialism, like the scramble for Africa in the 1880s and beyond, where the issue is all about the minerals and the raw materials that lie underneath the people's feet. They're not interested exactly in the people at all. And of course, they slaughter the people with horrific profligacy in the process of colonizing Africa. And that is, it's diamonds. It's the gold rush in South Africa. It's the diamond rush in South Africa. It's the rubber vines in the Congo, etc. It's not the people's labor, right? It's not the population as potential labor power. So they're not to be exploited.
Which means they're not to be emancipated either. Right.
Right. So but to get back to it, this issue of what Marx is, again, he doesn't think of imperialism as like the goal. He doesn't think that like colonizing or ruling over other people is like what defines imperialism. It's kind of like a symptomatic and secondary expression of it. Like when you were talking about, capital concentrations, export of capital, surplus capital. It's a consequence of things that are happening in the core of capital that then you see the dynamics that you see in the peripheries of capital.
Right.
For Marx, Britain in the 19th century, of course, is the global hegemon coming out of the Napoleonic Wars. Its navy rules the seas, rules the waves, and its militarization and its sort of authoritarianization generally takes the form of armies overseas, right? That's where you sort of train the British ruling class to govern men brutally. Right. So it's not exactly it doesn't look as like a strictly or a primarily domestic issue the way it does in France, because of the nature of what the British Empire is. But ultimately he's making an argument that what we see in France, we see in Britain, we see in Russia. There's ultimately the emergence of an imperialist world state for Marx. Which has all sorts of inner contradictions and turbulence and can in fact be expanded through war between states. Right. So his whole analysis of the Crimean War in the 1850s is what builds the world state is war between states. That strengthens the international capitalist state because it strengthens the czar, it strengthens the emperor of the French, it builds nationalism, it generates jingoism, it generates a will to die for your country, etc. And so war between states does not preclude the category of a world state for Marx. Quite the contrary. And of course,
this is the world state of the bourgeois or of the capitalist class. They divide their war is the way they rule, is basically how we might think of it. Is that right?
Except he doesn't really, when he says it's a capitalist state, he doesn't mean it's the capitalist state.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. The capitalists who are mere.
It crystallizes the problem of capitalism, not the people who own the factory.
Right. The capitalists are just hollow shells. They're just the puppets of the capitalist forces. But and those forces rule through war. So I want to ask you two more questions. We got to wrap it up here because I've got to run actually. But
what time is it?
How did Stalin? It's like 3:17. I want to talk to you off the record before I do run. How did the Stalinists use Marxist journalism to support their often contradictory policies? What is it about the journalism that allows it to be deployed in such a way? And that's it. That's my question.
I would say, first of all, I would say that there's something Stalinist about the journalism, the way that we might sort of pick it up and read it, because it didn't form a part or a major part of the Marxist critique of Stalinism. Right? There was a mobilization of Marx against communism in the 20th century. That, a lot of posthumously published writings, and of course his journalism isn't exactly posthumously published. It was published in his lifetime, but it was ephemeral, and people, the Second International Marxists didn't have it for the most, broadly speaking. There are exceptions. The 1844 manuscripts, the full manuscript of Marxist critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, the Grundrisse, right? These are classic, the German ideology. These are texts that were edited and published in the 20th century that form part of what we might call Marx's posthumous corpus, that were used by Sartre, by Marcuse, by all sorts of intellectuals, by Pastone, to make a critique of the left at that time, which of course included the communist left. And so we don't think of the Grundrisse as a particularly Stalinist document. We think of it as a kind of a new left document, right? It's like a new left Marx, right?
Yeah, I'm reading the German ideology with the patrons. So I guess I'm falling right in line with the new left.
It's Marx, right? It's great.
Yeah.
I got no problem with that, right? Obviously, the humanists, Raya Dunayevskaya, she made a lot of the 1844 manuscripts, right? They discovered, to Erich Fromm, of course, wrote a whole book, Marxist concept of man, right? So they get the humanism out of that, right? So there's all sorts of anti-Marx Marxes, right? And the journalism wasn't a part of that. The journalism was rediscovered initially by Eleanor Marx. I mean, it goes all the way back to the sort of earliest attempts to edit and posthumously publish Marx and Engels, which began right after Engels's life. Of course, Engels himself edited Capital. Eleanor Marx publishes some of her father's English language journalism, which is what the Second International had, because it got translated into German, into French for the most part. David Ryazanov became very interested in these writings and realized that there were flaws with Eleanor Marx's editions. It's the pursuit of the journalism is really what turned David Ryazanov into arguably the greatest Marx scholar who ever lived, the man who built the Marx Engels Institute, at the behest of Lenin, and was eventually killed by Stalin, stripped of his position, and then 7 years later killed. But nevertheless, the Marx Engels Institute, they were the ones that published 1844. Right? Ryazanov published all of those texts that we talked about, or set them in the train of being published before he was killed. And he had set in train. He'd brought communists from England to work in the Marx Engels Institute to identify Marx's writings, even by their style in the newspapers. He bought complete runs of the New York Tribune from New York City for the Institute. So all of that stuff was coming out in the 30s and 40s and was definitively available by the time of the New Left. By the 60s and 70s, it's basically available. And they just didn't make a whole lot of it. You get these books like Marx and Engels on colonialism, Marx and Engels on India, Marx and Engels on Britain, Marx and Engels on modernization, a truly 60s title, that were either popularly published or published by international publishers, the Communist Publishing House. And obviously it's very crudely sort of assimilated to a national roads to socialism view. They did the same thing with Lenin and Trotsky, even. Even the Trotskyists fall into this kind of way of editing Marx, and they might have included like little bits from Capital and some stuff from the correspondence, but most of those volumes tended to be the way that the communists, apart from the collected works, published the journalism. And I think that what's interesting is that for the most part it was assimilated to a 20th century anti-imperialism. And so Marx, like the edition of Marx's writings on the 1857 mutiny in India is titled "The First War of Indian Independence." Right? Marx is entirely assimilated to kind of an Indian nationalist, anti-colonialist argument, which is not really very accurate or helpful way of thinking about it. And I think that what we begin to see with a certain kind of post-colonial rejection in the 1970s of Marx, or accusations of Marx being Eurocentric, is precisely that the way that the Stalinists tried to promote Marx as an as a kind of third world thinker, as a kind of comrade of Ho Chi Minh, really wasn't entirely borne out by the writings themselves. I don't think that, one scholar of the subject just says, Marx doesn't have a category that corresponds to the 20th century category of imperialism. Like what he means by it is completely different. It's as I've tried to emphasize it, today and with you. And, when Marx says things like, well, if there's a socialist revolution in Britain, and if they, allow for the Indian people to appropriate to themselves the wealth capacity that has been scattered in their midst, but is held from them like, tantalus. If all of that happens, then the British will have been the British presence in India, they would have been an unconscious tool of history. Right. And the 20th century anti-imperialists are like, what are you talking about? The British in India are unconscious tools of history. Right. And then you get people who
no, he didn't say are, he said if. Didn't he?
Right. But then there are other people who will say, Marx is celebrating imperialism as emancipating people. In other words, Marx becomes, either celebrating imperialism as a force of modernization, or castigating imperialism as some kind of racist, I don't know what, sadomasochist theater. And and of course neither one is true. And I think that it's and Trotskyists defend it, and Maoists tend to hate it, right? Because it gets caught up in that antinomy of a focus on politics in the core of capitalism versus a third world strategy, etc. So
I should have you back on in like a week or so to just talk about third worldism, maybe, or and in the context of what we talked about today. You gave me a lot to think about in this first session. I feel like I need to listen to it again and write down all of my questions from just this conversation and have you back. But for now, I'm gonna end the conversation here. Spencer, thanks for doing the first Pop the Left. You're gonna have to come back and do more. Okay.
Cool.